Good evening, and thank you so much for joining us at this virtual presentation. So my name is Annie Harris, and I'm with the Essex National Heritage Area, which is all of Essex County, North Shore and Lower Merrimack Valley. And today is Wednesday, it's June 16th, 2021. And we are very happy to welcome everyone to the second of three conversations in this year's Redefining Heritage series. So a few important notes before we begin. First of all, I want to thank the City of Salem for sponsoring this talk tonight. We really appreciate their support, and many thanks to Elizabeth Peterson, who helped to arrange that. Then I want to mention that there are live captions available for those who would prefer them. In the menu at the bottom of your screen, you will want to select closed caption and then the show subtitle to enable that feature. And then if you want to turn it off, it says hide subtitle. So following the presentation, there will be a question and answer period with the presenters. Please submit your questions by typing them into the chat box, and you can do that at any point during this conversation. And then we'll try to get to as many questions as we can before the end of the program. Program will last about an hour and 15 minutes, at most an hour and a half. Finally, this presentation will be recorded and made available on the Essex Heritage YouTube channel, so you'll be able to see it again and share it with your friends. We will provide a link to this recording to everyone who's attending tonight once it's uploaded. It'll take us a couple of days to do that. Now, for the program, let me just say a little bit about Redefining Heritage. It's a new discussion series that we've started this year, presented by Essex Heritage. And we're exploring a variety of perspectives on topics related to our natural, cultural, and historic resources, particularly things that are often overlooked or considered to be immutable or unchanging. We're actually taking a much harder look at some of these, and it's been a really fascinating deep dive. The purpose is to help us think about how we can all be more actively involved in the areas of heritage, such as conservation, arts advocacy, expanded historical awareness, and other themes relevant to being more engaged with our communities and hopefully being more inclusive. This year's series has focused on the interaction with the environment and what we can learn from a deeper connection to the natural world. Our first presentation on May 19th was called Garbage to Gardens, and it is available on the Essex Heritage YouTube channel if you'd like to see it. It was a very lively conversation, so I think you will enjoy that. Following tonight's presentation, we will have one more conversation on July 21st. It will be called Art for Awareness, and it will highlight two local artists who have focused on capturing the effects of climate change on the Great Marsh through a variety of media. And they've also been using their art as an educational tool to raise awareness about the health of this really significant resource. Just to remind you, the Great Marsh is the largest salt marsh in New England. It stretches from Gloucester to Salisbury, and it's a region of great environmental importance and some concern. So that will also be an important talk. So tonight, I'm very pleased to present. Tonight's talk is Interwoven Interactions, and this talk will explore the complexities of the relationships and ways of knowing that Indigenous people of the Northeast bring to our interactions with each other and the world, for both an historical and a contemporary context. We will examine how colonialization disrupted these relationships and subsequently contributed to the decline of environmental sustainability in this region. Finally, we will consider how people from the dominant culture and the Indigenous people can learn together and create new relationships with each other in the world that arise from multiple ways of knowing. So our speakers tonight are Elizabeth Solomon of the Massachusett tribe and Kristen Wyman of the Nipmuc tribe. And first, we will start with Elizabeth Solomon. She's an enrolled member and officer of the Massachusett tribe at Pokapuu, I'm not saying that right, Solomon advocates on local Indigenous issues and has a long-standing commitment to human rights, diversity, inclusion, and community building that she brings to both her paid and her volunteer work. She serves on multiple advisory and management boards, including those for the Boston Harbor Islands National Park and the Stone Living Lab in Boston. Ms. Solomon holds a master's degree in museum studies, regularly consults with museums, historical societies, municipalities, and educators to bring the voice, histories, and perspective of Native peoples and other underrepresented communities to the forefront. Ms. Solomon currently works as the Director of Administration in the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences in the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. And she has more than 3 decades of public health experience working in both university and community-based settings. So with that, Elizabeth Solomon, I turn this over to you. We're very pleased to have you tonight. Thanks so much.
Sorry, a little bit trouble unmuting. I apologize. And I'm also going to share my screen, so I hope you'll bear with me while I do that. Okay, and actually that's the wrong one. Here we go. So, so thank you so much, Annie. Very, very nice to be introduced by you, and very happy to be here tonight. As Annie was saying, I'm a member of the Massachusett tribe at Ponkapog, and the Massachusett are the host community of a good portion of Essex County. And we hold that the Essex County quite dear. And I'm going to actually start this, speaking of, marshes. This is a photo of one of the estuaries in Essex County. It's quite amazing and quite beautiful, and hoping that many people have had an opportunity to visit. And I just started with this just to kind of have people think about the landscape, at least on the coastal landscape, of the area in which you live. And having done that, I'm going to take us 5,000 miles away to Hawaii. Now, why in the world would I take people from Essex County to Hawaii? And there's a couple of reasons. And the reason I'm doing it is that when I visited Hawaii, it seems like yesterday because it was in the fall of 2019 before we went into lockdown because of the pandemic, and it I was struck by really how different it was in terms of connection to the land among Native Hawaiians in ways that it's more difficult for us to do here. And one of the things um, that is a saying is what is good for the land is good for the people. And in Hawaiian, and I will butcher the pronunciation on this, but it's O Kamea Kupono Aina, Kamea Kupono Kanaka. And it's translated as what is good for the land is good for the people. And the kapono part is what is translated as good. However, and so, I want to kind of go back. One of the reasons I'm talking about this from the standpoint of Native Hawaiian is because this is a place where I am able to kind of look at Indigenous ways of thinking about the land in a native language. We are still in the process of reclaiming the Massachusett language, which is a common language that was spoken by multiple tribes in the area. And so I'm not currently able to do this in the language of my ancestors, so I need to do it in the language of someone else's ancestors. So one of the things that I thought was interesting, though, is that when you look at the word kapono, which is what has been translated as good, instead of just being the idea of good, it means to be forthright, honest, and fair in your relationships with others. So it really transforms the idea of what it means to what that saying really means, as opposed to it being good for the what's good for the land is good for the people, meaning that there is a responsibility to be forthright, honest, and fair in your relationships with both the land and with others. So I kind of bring that in as sort of a framing of a way to kind of think about interactions with land that is different than maybe what the dominant culture normally is used to. And so one of the things that I like to start with is having people think about how though we in the Euro American culture, and all of us here are part of the Euro American culture, and we tend to see ourselves primarily as separate from our environment. Although we recognize that we live in the world and that the world is an important part of where we are. In many cases, we see ourselves as primarily separate and see ourselves as living on living on a place, living on the world, living in terms of it's we although we are part of it, we are in very many ways separate. Whereas in many indigenous cultures, we see ourselves living with as opposed to living on or living in. And so we see ourselves frequently as inseparable for the environment. And whereas in the previous graphic, you saw a person and the world and they were separated, there is there intentionally are no images here of of individual things, because people would be somewhere, oops, people would be somewhere in this very big spirally circle of the multiple uh, entities and things that make up our world as a whole. So there's a fundamental difference between how the dominant culture and indigenous cultures would interact with and live with the places where we're in. Um, I wanted to kind of look in case people are interested in terms of indigenous territories or native territories here in Massachusetts. This is a map from the Encyclopedia Britannica, which really kind of, from a colonial point of view, at least in terms of boundaries of Massachusetts, really talks about, if you see the red lines, that's where the pilgrims would have come initially for their landing and colonization of Plymouth. And actually, the blue line you see here and this here are colonial boundaries between, say, Massachusetts Bay County and Plymouth County, and then what is now Connecticut. And you can see one of the things I wanted to put this up here for is that there are areas where different tribes had territory. You would not necessarily see what you see here, well, not here, but what you see here, where you have a lot of um, delineation by either city. This one particular one is zip code. So really, although we had territories, it's not like we had like these very strict borders. Um, this is if you're looking at this, this is a map from 1774, I believe, of the Boston Harbor, which shows the Boston Harbor and environs, because here's the inner harbor and here's much is the outer harbor, and here's the North Shore up here, so the beginning of the North Shore. And this is sort of the area that the Massachusett tribe, at least on the shore, we would have had some territory a little bit north and a little bit south, and then territory inland west, but this is where we would have been. And one of the things that I want to have you think about is that over the period of colonization, which immediately followed a series of plagues which wiped out between 75 and 90% of the indigenous population in the Northeast, um, that that we had colonial settlement that took place over a period of time. And I developed a series of maps that kind of show this. And you can see here is, and these have actually a lot of native names as opposed to just colonial names. And here we have Patuxet and Plymouth, Patuxet and Kingston. This is in 1620. Here we have settlement that's happens in the 1630s. And then here you have settlement in the 1640s. So if you look at the map in a period of 40 years or a little bit over 40 years, the entire coastline of Massachusetts Bay has been colonized. And what this has meant, particularly for the Massachusetts people, this did not necessarily happen on the Cape, but what this meant for the Massachusetts people is that our access to the shore was completely blocked within 20 to 25 years of colonization. And since we were a seasonal people, that became very problematic. Um, that was just sort of like a little bit of history. And I want to kind of use maps to kind of look at different ways of looking at the land. And so this is a map that I showed earlier that really kind of looks at zip codes. And one of the reasons I wanted to kind of put this in here is that there's this huge emphasis on boundaries, which really kind of is very typical of the dominant culture and how they see land. It is divided in so many different ways. This way tends to be in terms of zip codes. This one tends to be is showing transportation routes, which are the transportation routes in terms of the commuter rail up to the North Shore. These are the major roads. And although you do see something in terms of topography, you see some things in terms of like waterways here and spaces that are green spaces. There's not a lot that tells you about what's actually on the land. It's about how people use the land. Um, and even when you look at a topographic map, which this is one from Map Hill, um, even within that, even when you're trying to look at topography, there's always these boundaries. And if we think about how we look at maps, we really do kind of look at those boundaries to orient ourselves. It's very hard if you're just looking at a map, and it's hard for me too. When you're looking at a map without any boundaries to kind of to actually place yourself. We're so used to looking at the boundaries of Massachusetts, the boundaries of the United States, or the boundaries of our cities and towns in order to orient ourselves in space. So I really like this map. This does actually, if you zoom in, have places where you can see place names. But this, I think, is really cool because it shows a lot of the waterways, and unlike how we get around now, traditionally within indigenous culture, we use the waterways as ways of moving around. And so it's really kind of interesting to kind of look at this and see if you can actually orient yourself about where you are. Um, so it's kind of interesting. And then I kind of want to go back after looking at that. This would be more of a way that we would traditionally look at space in terms of the waterways, the features, what was in a particular place, as opposed to who possessed it, who has control over it. And I wanted to kind of just talk about that, just kind of bring that up in terms of a way of looking at space and land. Um, I'm going to go now down to the more micro, and this is a aerial view of the area around Cranes Beach, which really kind of gives a really good indication of the topography of the land, how things move together. I really like this from the standpoint of looking at how dynamic things are. You can tell just by looking at this picture that these areas here are definitely dynamic. They're not static. You can tell but that the water is changing them on a regular basis. And I think that's really, really interesting because we tend to, within the dominant culture, to think about space as permanent. And it really isn't. And I think that it's really interesting to start looking at maps and topography from the standpoint of how they change over time. And some people may be familiar with this, but 10,000 years ago, Boston Harbor was actually dry land. And then about, 400 years ago, when the colonists first came, much of Boston was actually underwater. And so our environment changes constantly in small ways and over time in large ways. And these are things that we are becoming more and more aware of within the dominant culture as a result of what we're dealing with in terms of climate change. So this is also another view of an estuary on the North Shore, and again looking at how the water moves in. So this is a river coming from inland into the ocean, and so these are places where fresh water comes in, ocean fresh water goes out, ocean water goes in, and is again a very dynamic place. Here's another view looking at basically marshes, salt marshes, and looking at the topography of the land in terms of how naturally there are different variations, ways of, and if you look at this in terms of climate change, these are the natural way of actually doing wave attenuation and managing flooding, because when you have these large salt marshes and estuaries that are left intact, they have the ability to absorb water, both absorb water and to attenuate wave action. And here, this is a photo of Essex Harbor. And again, this is within an estuary system. And again, you kind of see of course, there are houses here, but you can see this very uh, patchy place that's neither land nor water, but is a combination of the two. And this is just another view of salt marshes, and another, and another. Um, I brought this back. We're coming back to the Colonial Map of Boston. And if you look, this is a very different place than what it looks like now. It's kind of hard to see this, but I wanted to include this one because it has it actually includes Essex County, which is actually a place where you do have extensive, as Annie mentioned earlier, extensive salt marshes, and have places where you can have resilience to rising waters, and where you do not have that in Boston. And I brought this in to kind of show the difference between what has happened in Boston, and particularly in Boston, in the greater Boston area, since colonial times, to change the landscape to make this very, very difficult for there actually to be the marshes and natural ways of managing incoming water or ocean level rise. If you look here, this is actually what was the original Boston. This is Shawmut Peninsula. And everything around it is water, but all of this has been filled in. So, and this area here, right here, is now the airport. And so you have this area where where the the culture, the dominant culture, has approached the use of land in terms of managing it in a way that preferences the use of humans and not the use of other entities that live here, and also is probably not in the long run to our advantage, as we are discovering now that we are really actually changing the land in such a way that it is becoming very, very problematic for us as the environment is changing in terms of global warming or climate change and sea rise. Um, this is a view of Beverly Harbor. And again, you can see the incredible development here that is along the coast. And where there is very little that actually can attenuate the effects of sea level rise and how that might affect the area. This is an aerial view of the Gloucester area where you can see again the development, and then other places where there actually is less developed land, which may actually help as we move forward in terms of climate change. I brought this in because, like, everybody knows, or most of us in New England, like, this is like one of the most, photographed or drawn, scenes in certainly in New England. Um, but I bring it in to kind of give an example of how much there is in terms of hardscape here and how little space there is between the ocean and actually the buildings and the homes that are here. And that is something that has happened up and down the coast of Massachusetts, that makes it that really kind of is a way of being on the land that again is not really taking into account how nature interacts with us, nature interacts with in general. And therefore we're now at a position where we're trying to figure out, okay, now what do we do now that we've kind of moved all of the salt marshes that could help attenuate the issues. This also, I believe, is in Gloucester, and this is a very large seawall. And this is in, I believe this is in Nahant. So really, kind of all of this is to kind of think about um, different ways of being in space and living with the land as opposed to living on the land. And that in living with the land, the idea being that we we are able to interact in our relations with the land and with each other in a way that is beneficial to both. And so we kind of talk about this in indigenous cultures as reciprocity, in that we are not the most important living thing on the earth. We live on the earth, we're part of the earth, not separate from it. And really kind of starting to, maybe there's ways that we can start thinking about how we might want to think about being in good relation with the land and in our environment, as opposed to changing it in a way that only privileges humans, and sometimes very particular humans. Um, and so I just want to leave this with, again, what is good for the land is good for the people, knowing that the word good means to be in good and right relations. And then to ask the question, do you have a relationship with this place called Essex County? If so, what is it? And what would you like it to be? Thank you.
I have to get my unmute. Thank you. Thank you very much. Very interesting. Um, so now we will hear from Kristen Wyman of the Nipmuc Nation. She is an advocate for tribal self-determination and revitalizing indigenous foodways and economies. For over 15 years, Kristen has worked as a consultant with nonprofit organizations, tribal governments, and state and federal agencies, including Native Land Conservancy, the Nipmuc Indian Development Corporation, the Mashpee Wampanoag Natural Resource Department and Educational Department, the Massachusetts Department of Public Health, the National Park Service, and the University of Massachusetts at Boston. She's initiated several women and youth-led programs in areas of environmental justice, violence and substance abuse prevention, youth development, food sovereignty, and transformative leadership and nonprofit development. And Kristen says her fight for the rights to land, to food, to medicine, and human dignity is completely tied to her identity and responsibility as a Nipmuc woman, mother, and daughter. She is co-organizer of the Eastern Woodlands Remachiation, the EWR. It's a network of Indigenous women and two spirits restoring the foundation of sustainable food systems. Her work is deeply personal and motivated by the important role of women as landholders, farmers, cultural bearers, artisans, and diplomats. As the Global Movements Program Manager with Why Hunger, Kristen supports social movement processes at the global level in their path towards food sovereignty and liberation. Kristen is a graduate of UMass Amherst with a degree in legal studies, political science, and Native American studies. She also has completed her Master of Science program in environmental conservation from the University of New Hampshire. Kristen, we are pleased to welcome you tonight.
Thanks so much, Annie, and thank you all for having me. Elizabeth, that was a really great framing. As Annie had mentioned, I'm Kristen, I'm Nipmuc, and my ancestors are the Speens, some of the original proprietors of Natick. And so that particular area is actually where I grew up and where I call home. Although I am bicultural in the sense that my grandmother married into the Mashpee Wampanoag community. So I was also raised, with my relatives on Cape Cod. The Natick people have a history of being relocated to Deer Island in Boston Harbor. And so I also call that place home or a resting place of many of my ancestors and relatives, which is why I'm calling in from Nantasket Beach. So I'm on the South Shore and have lived here basically since I started working for the Boston Harbor Islands, basically as close as I can get to the islands without living on them. And I consider myself a guest in Massachusett territory, although as Elizabeth shared, nothing is permanent. Things are always changing, and our borders weren't completely rigid. And so in a lot of our genealogies, there's overlap and connections. And so I just wanted to follow that up too. Somebody asked about the Pennacook people. And while today we have Massachusett and Nipmuc, just want to emphasize that a lot of us are related genealogically, and have many of the same struggles. And at the same time, our connection to these particular landscapes are highly contextualized, which is why I'm going to talk mostly about my lived experience and how I understand these concepts as a Natick person. So I'm going to share my screen. And just also want to give the heads up that I am suffering from really bad allergies. So I'm hoping that I make it through this talk okay. I've got my tea and my cough drops here. I'm actually going to go back through. Here we go. So in thinking about, the framing of my talk is really around like relational landscapes. This is a concept that came up by a Mohawk seed keeper named Rowan White. And I have some of Rowan's work at the end of this slideshow. But that idea of relational landscapes really lands with me. Everything comes down to relationality. And I kind of went through this roundabout way of understanding my place and our responsibility to the land and to the beings. First by, attending college and connecting with other Native students. And it helped me connect the dots a lot about my experiences growing up in my traditional homelands. And then I started working for the Boston Harbor Islands National Park as a youth advocate and as an advocate for my ancestors and other Native people to have access and have a seat at the table. I found through that time that there was always a struggle and a fight for us to have a seat at the table, to be able to share our perspectives and connections to the islands, and realize just how much it was not necessarily a reciprocal relationship. While I do commend the Boston Harbor Islands for following through with their legislative mandate of engaging Native people, particularly those with historical genealogical connections to the Boston Harbor Islands, it still feels like we're kind of going in circles around perspectives of interacting with the land. And while I was out there and listening to a lot of the tours, it seems that our connections were really pretty much reduced to a lot of the traumas that we experienced, particularly in the forced removal and relocation. And basically it was a concentration camp in October of 1675 where we were removed. I knew that our relationship to this place was so much more than just this kind of horrible time in history. And it kind of propelled me to pursue that the graduate studies at the University of New Hampshire in environmental conservation. And it was really difficult for me because I did not consider myself a hard scientist. I'm a social scientist. And that process really depleted me of just realizing the divisions and the understandings of environmental conservation really seemed to be a one-sided lens. And especially being in New Hampshire, where it is a state primarily focused on environment, and many folks are handing over their land for conservation and for stewardship and perpetuity. That's commendable, and at the same time, I always struggled with this kind of one-sided model of conservation, where it seems that humans can't relate, or that we're some sort of negative being interacting with the environment in that way. And that's just not the reality of Native people. While all of us are impacted by colonization, and we're living in this time where we're really siloed and disconnected from the landscape, I think we hold a lot of this knowledge within our DNA, within our historical memory, or what Rowan White would call our blood memory, that our relationship goes much deeper, and it's codified through our arts, through our language, through our relationships with each other, through the ways that we dress and why we hold ceremony and why we have our dances. We've never lost that. And so I believe in blood memory. I believe in the spirals. I love the spirals that Elizabeth showed. I don't know if you can see, I've got this kind of infinity bracelet. It makes me think of that, that nothing is permanent. And through all of this work, I've arrived at food sovereignty as a focus. That's what I do in my full-time professional work. And then outside, I organize with this collective called Eastern Woodlands Rematriation. And it's really about changing and returning to that kind of epistemology or way of connecting, not just with the earth, but with each other, and in a way that is not about dominance or control, but about reciprocity and about caretaking. And so that's kind of where I'm arriving to this conversation, is just, I think Elizabeth did a great job of that framing and that positioning us within the landscape. And then I just want us to maybe go a little bit deeper about what those relationships look like. So it's really hard to not talk about our cosmovisions. It's kind of a risky thing. This is a depiction of Sky Woman. It's Haudenosaunee cosmovision, which is very relevant to our people here, that really talks about this primacy of water in the Northeast landscape. And we see that with Elizabeth's presentation. And in this story of Sky Woman, this is how it said the earth is formed. And this is something you'd be able to read about if anyone's read Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Kimmerer. They talk about this kind of collective cooperation of all these beings that needed to figure out how to hold and receive Sky Woman, as Sky Woman was pirouetting from the sky world, and that she was holding this seed. And through the sacrifice and the collectivity of the beings in the water world, it was the muskrat that risked its life to gather the soil to lay on Turtle's back. From there, the seed was planted. And that's how the earth came to be. I learned this, I don't have the word here in Penobscot. There's a certain element of just finding balance of what is shared and what's protected as knowledge. And so I hope that's received well. I think oftentimes we're asked to share a lot about these teachings, and the experience sometimes is that it can be used or twisted in a way that compromises a lot of the power behind these stories and our teachings. And so I hope that's understood. I was told about this word in the Penobscot language, Wabanaki people of the Dawnland, so pretty much Essex, right above Essex County, that their word for soil means life comes from it. And this is what I mean about some of these teachings being codified in the language, that, we're not just calling it dirt. It's not just this abstract thing, but it's actually alive and profound. And when we think about it in that way, hopefully, it's treated with a little bit more respect, which has not been the case since settlement, and just the way we've considered the power of what the soil holds. And if we think deeply about this creation story, and that it, if it weren't for that mud, the seed wouldn't be able to grow and to sprout. And yeah, I'll share a little bit of this experience once where I was meeting with a bunch of farmers in Boston, and they talked about how they were able to revitalize this growing space, but all the soil was contaminated and they had to throw it out and then bring new soil in. And I understand that. And at the same time, it was a little bit re-triggering of just like our lack of consideration for something so powerful, that we've kind of just decentered, I guess. So just really wanted to center that in our conversation. Similarly to the maps, to go off the map theme, I wanted to bring this in. This is a map by Abenaki scholar Lisa Brooks, and it's showing the different praying towns. So as I mentioned, my people come from Natick, and the reason I have this map, similarly to why Elizabeth shared, is just to emphasize the waterways and the ways that we're all connected. And of course, including the river, to just emphasize our traditional highways. You know, these were some of the first impacted through settlement. When we think about the ways the mills were constructed to make up for like a booming settler population, and how what that really symbolizes the blocking of the riverways, because these were our ways to connect with each other. And so those are some of our first divisions. You know, blocking that, and then also blocking our fish runs, which, you know, our food source, our nutrition source, and even economic livelihood. I don't know too much about this image, but for me, it means, yeah, I guess I would take a step back. You know, it's well documented that for a while before permanent settlement, folks were coming and visiting the shores and extracting from our woodlands, and extracting a lot of our natural resources for financing the building of ships in Europe and in building economies. So our people were familiar with and had already had experience with folks coming and taking. And so there was a little bit of that collective memory. And what was different, I think, when Puritans settled is that they were bringing their families. And for the longest time, I don't believe that's what was happening. And so this, I think, was a signifier that something was a little bit different here, and that these folks were here to stay. And of course, with all of this interaction, you know, we had the epidemics and the disease, you know, to wipe out approximately 90% of our population. I think that in and of itself speaks volumes to why I feel that sense of responsibility in this time and what I choose to do with my life, and why it is so focused on the organizing and not just teaching and raising awareness among the non-Native community, but actually probably more importantly to focus internally within my Native relations. And that's why being a mom is so important to me. And even before I birthed children, I was raising youth, and really just helping us remember how we're survivors, right? To be able to survive everything that's happened. Again, I'm circling back to that like infinity symbol, or the spirals, or the change, and we're here for a reason, and we have this collective memory. And I do believe that we are returning in many ways, and we've survived in many ways. We're just highly erased, but we're here. And so this is a daily pain and a reality that we live with every day as Native people living in our traditional homelands. Most of us, I'd say the majority of us, are landless. There's no one in my immediate tribal community that owns any land. And so, yeah, I see climate resilience and honoring heritage and survival and finding solutions. What I see as critical to that is countering that erasure, understanding how we're still here in what the landscape means to us, but also giving us opportunity to have our land back. So as I mentioned, my ancestors were forcefully removed by proclamation of the Mass Bay Colony. This was during Metacom's conflict, or Indian uprising, or King Philip's War. They were taken in the middle of the night, actually. And I don't know if anybody remembers this last October when we had that crazy snowstorm. That was actually the anniversary of their removal. So it puts into perspective just the conditions that were there, our people would not have been staying that close to the shore, to the islands at that time in the season. In fact, we were probably storing our foods from the harvest and keeping our seeds for the next year's crop. You know, that's what was on our mind, is just, you know, the food and the caretaking for the months that were coming ahead, and to be forced to leave all of that. You know, another moment in history that most people would not survive, you'd think, and yet we're here. So in the years that follow, these are some depictions, like the boat with the timber. There was a lot of deforestation that happened. That's actually an image that was used to talk about the Mashpee Wood Revolt. I think it was in the 1800s. I had mentioned the dams, the damming of our rivers. And then the stone walls. I'm sure we're all familiar with the stone walls. There's some crazy statistic that I think if you added up all of the acres of stone walls in New England, it would circle the globe 4 times. I don't know, I should probably have a note card on that, but feel free to look it up. I'm pretty sure it's accurate. And I have these just to talk about the way extractivism was such an abrupt change for the landscape. And in that kind of division, the dams and the stone walls are such a symbol of this kind of different understanding. You know, we had lands in common. Being in the food justice movement, I'm very aware that a lot of folks are kind of returning to this concept of land in common, except nowadays they're just kind of trendy words like eco-village and things like that. But these are all borrowed concepts from Native ways of knowing, which, by the way, if we think about the story of Sky Woman, or even our cosmovisions, because most Indigenous peoples would share about their cosmovisions, you know, these were thousands of years of struggle over time. It's not to suggest that we were like these perfect beings and had this perfect way of relating, or that we didn't manage or steward the land in a way that, yeah, I guess the word would be managed, that we didn't manage the land, and that it was somehow this wild, it was wild in its existence, and, you know, humans didn't interact with it in a way that would control it in some way. I don't think that's true. I think we had really strong relations over time and did a lot to pay attention to what our elders were teaching us, and the stories that were shared around where we belonged and how to interact with the landscape. And so when there's this abrupt shift, there's this disruption in that trajectory of knowledge and that ability, that forced assimilation into Christianity, the forcing us into being farmers and working the land in a very different way than how we did for thousands of years. And then this kind of perspective of property and division of property. These are all things that we're still grappling with today. And yeah, I very much see these instances of settlerism as interruptions, but I don't think they're finite. I don't think we're done. Again, just drawing back to that spiral, and that things are always changing. I think we're just arriving at different points of consciousness and connecting the dots. Here's a petition from one of my ancestors in Natick, and you can't read it, but this is a petition of Hannah Speen, basically needing to sell some land, a few acres of land, because her son had got in trouble. You know, when we returned home, well, many didn't return home. Many perished on Deer Island. Many were forced into slavery. and many were forced as indentured servants to try to make ends meet. Some folks did actually get to return to their relative area of land. Many Nipmuc folks sought refuge in other tribal communities north. And they have since, I imagine, been adopted and probably identify as those tribal peoples, but maybe their origins were here, but they were fleeing during that time. So this idea that somebody got in trouble and needs to sell their lands for getting this person out of jail or whatever the situation may have been indicates to me perhaps colorism, right? Like I am a white Afro-descending Native person. My ancestry has deep connections with enslaved folks of the diaspora. Like if we know that history and that Boston was a port of slavery, it makes a lot of sense. And so I mentioned that here because I think this was just an additional tactic to displace us from the landscape. This idea of having to sell off the land and that folks were being criminalized. I can't help but wonder if there was racism involved in that, but definitely this perception that we were to be controlled. We had court-appointed guardians that would oversee the land transactions. So the idea that they even had to appoint somebody to do that on our behalf, and actually, if you look at the records, there was pretty much a financial incentive in some of these land deals that would go to the court-appointed guardians, and sometimes if they didn't show up, the land by default would just be sold. So further displacement. Some of the other erroneous debts came from tax liens or medical liens. And there's an author called Jean O'Brien. She's an Ojibwe person that wrote Dispossession by Degrees. So if anybody's interested in learning more about that, she did a lot of work around, it's not just the war, it's not just the disease, but even the years after, the way we were slowly pushed off the land. This is an image of one aspect of land back, I consider, or if we're thinking about just like cultural heritage or ways of connecting. Every year, many of us gather to remember the sacrifices of our ancestors and that forced removal by symbolically bringing them back home. So we go out to Deer Island and many of us paddle across Boston Harbor, 17 miles up Charles River and to the furthest navigable point of the river. And then some of us walk and run the rest of the way. I think it's about 10 or 11 miles back to Natick. And we feast there after that. But this is a whole journey. It's a time of ceremony. It's not an event. It's not a reenactment. It's really our way of remembering and holding close our connectivity to the water, to our ancestors, to this place that we belong. And it's a really interesting journey to, have this juxtapose of the highly developed city. And even when we're paddling, like we'll cross duck boats and everybody's honking and waving, or, if it's a nice day, there's pleasure boats out on the water waving, and they just have no idea that we're in prayer and that we're in ceremony and that we're doing this. So I guess I bring that up as a way of relating to the land, of being actively alive and connected in a way that spans all time. And that's usually how people that are paddling, people that are in the journey, describe that experience. That kind of time during that point makes no sense, and that it's just all this kind of being present in past, present, future, dream time, all at the same time. I'm not going to play it now, but I mentioned how a lot of the inspiration from this idea of relational landscapes comes from Mohawk seedkeeper Rowan White. I highly recommend this YouTube clip. It's focused on food systems, but just talks a lot about, our blood memory, that, we are a manifestation of our ancestors' dreams. We have a role in this present time. We're not a thing of the past, and we're actively remembering and actively reclaiming. And so I guess a role for everybody that's in this space right now is, one, obviously to bear witness to what Elizabeth and I are sharing, but two, to think deeply about how these ways of being, how our way of relating is our right, and that the land is so held and divided in a way that limits our access and ability to continue that trajectory of ways of being. And really, I mean, I think we have a lot to offer: solutions around climate, solutions around environmental conservation. And in our perspective, there's no way to caretake if there's not a relationship there. And so, yeah, the only way of regaining that relationship is to think deeply about ourselves as part, like Elizabeth said, living with the land, not in control of it, but as part of it, and learning from it, and seeing ourselves as relatives. And that's about it. I will stop screen share as soon as I figure it out.
Well, thank you. Very sobering. Kristen and Elizabeth, I think you wanted to talk a little bit together. I think you're both unmuted. Let me just turn it over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Kristen, for that really wonderful, detailed talk about how we relate to place, and how the dominant culture, and particularly colonialism, has really disrupted that in ways that we're still trying to recover from. And I think I've been sort of looking at some of the chats, and some of the questions are around how people from the dominant culture can support us. And I'm wondering if we kind of want to have a little conversation among ourselves, among the two of us, about what that might look like to us. And I think we probably have places where we intersect really well, and then other places where we might have, sort of different perspectives. So I know you're having you're having coughing and allergy problems, so I will start. So one of the things that I think is really important is, as you were saying, Kristen, the relationship with the land, and the need for us to have, Indigenous people, to have very close relationship with the land, which really means have rematriation in some ways. It doesn't mean that we, at least from my perspective, and from the Massachusett tribe's perspective, that doesn't mean that we expect that everything that was in our territory will then become in our control. We recognize we live here with other people, and that's not going to change. However, I think there is a real need for us to have cultural, physical, and relational, not so much control, but with the land that is not mitigated or influenced by the dominant culture. That there are ways that we really need to do that work on our own, and if there are ways that people within the dominant culture can facilitate that or assist us with that, that's really helpful. One of my other perspectives is it would be great if folks really learned the history of what happened here. I think that we have much of what happened here became the mythology of the rest of the country, and much of that mythology is completely false. And so it's really important in terms of for not just us, but for the society as a whole, for everybody who lives here on Turtle Island, to understand what has happened here in the past 400 or 500 years, to really kind of have an understanding about that, to really have deep knowledge about that, and to make sure that you're teaching your children that really, that I think is really the first step. If you understand the history, you can start to understand a way to move forward. I'll stop there and see if you have, some other comments.
Yeah, I love how you're like, some things we may agree on and some things we may disagree on. I think I'm finding, I mean, as I mentioned, I'm a youth worker, or I was for a really long time, and I feel in many ways I'm aging out of that. There's younger folks I've mentored that are now becoming youth workers, and either way, I still stay very closely connected to that, and I'm finding that in the younger generations, there's this kind of rising intolerance to the way this kind of dominant system has laid things out, that that I think what I've found from my elders and the generations before me, like my grandmother, the reason I started working for the Boston Harbor Islands is because my grandmother was always showing up to fulfill her role on the advisory council and to make sure, that our ancestors are not forgotten. I think there it settled at, in growing up, she always told me that she wasn't able to talk about her identity. You just kept it quiet. And if we think about even the laws that were in place, they relate to the praying towns, but there was this law that was in place, right? I think it was maybe Romney that repealed it. I can't remember when, but this law that we couldn't be outside of the confines, basically, of our praying towns. That was in place for a really long time, and we were to be shot on site. So thinking about how that translated generationally, in this kind of pressure of assimilation, and then growing up in a time where your previous generations were so displaced and traumatized in so many ways from the disease, right? If we really think about that and what that was like to witness everybody dying and not get proper burials, then to have this conflict, because it wasn't one-sided, right? We know it wasn't just the natives fighting for their land against the English. There was a lot of intertribal conflict in war and pressure. In fact, my ancestors have petitioned, it's on record, there's petition to the Mass Bay colony about Mohawk raids in their territory. There's so much conflict. There's the religious fundamentalism piece, and how that translated to my grandmother's generation of just keeping silent. That makes a lot of sense. And so for her, there was just this, we're being invited to the decision-making table, we're being included here, but I'm also seeing this transition of the younger generations saying this isn't enough. And so I'm leaning into that because I'm thinking ahead, right? That concept of the 7 generations of what's to come. How do we prepare? Because at the same time, a lot more people were finding the general population. There are people who are asking these questions, we're seeing it in the chat, or, how can we be in more support, or what can we do? And they're wanting to be allies. Some of them are wanting to be accomplices. I say accomplice because sometimes ally isn't enough. And I'm going to give some examples, right? even in the food work that we do. We have some landowners who are wanting to include us in some capacity, and some of it is very limited, like, you know, you can come and harvest here, or you know, we want to do a land acknowledgement, you know, that might be one way. Some are way more radical. Some are actually buying land on behalf of other Native people, none that I know of right now. But some are actually figuring out ways to rematriate the land. And so, yeah, I'm forgetting what the question is, but I do remember a question in the chat, which was like, explain rematriation. And I think what's really important when we talk about land back or rematriation and what that means to us and what we're wanting, right? Yeah, some of us are patient with those small steps of the land acknowledgement. I'm growing a little bit impatient, just really thinking about the access to power, the access to resources that are so unequal right now. But when we think about rematriation, it's not a concern of like, if they have this, I'm going to lose this. It's not this idea of, you know, we're the dominant culture. Like, well, you know, we get that a lot, right? Elizabeth, like, well, the war was over, or this is just the way it is. This assumption that we forever need to be subordinate, or that our worldview always needs to be subordinate. No, I actually believe our worldview has a lot to offer. And so it is very difficult when people are fascinated by that and yet can't show in behavior that they're really trusting of that. If we all believed in rematriation, we would trust that it's a balance of power. It's that reciprocity piece. It doesn't mean that if you give land back to Native people, you're not going to belong there either. Because if we think really deeply at the root of our worldviews, right, that story of Sky Woman is that everybody belongs and has a role. What we're tired of, what I'm growing tired of, is cherry picking what folks want from our culture without really taking some time to try to make change. Yeah, I don't know what the question was.
Yeah.
I guess this is the point of us having a conversation.
Yeah.
We have these conversations anyway.
Yeah, all the time. Yeah. So I think that also goes back to the concern about from the dominant culture about rematriation, goes back to the idea of privatization of land and the idea of ownership and control. And that if you look at the idea in terms of as you were saying, this reciprocity and relationship, and the idea that everybody belongs here and has a role, that the assumption is that we are going to react to how we interact with lands the same way the dominant culture does, and we don't. And so you know, I think some of those questions or some of those concerns come out of the way that the dominant culture has been structured, and the way that the dominant culture, and we're all in the dominant culture. I mean, none of us are outside of it, regardless of how we might as Indigenous people be trying to move away from that and move more closely to the way of our ancestors. That you can't like make that assumption. If you're only coming from the perspective of the dominant culture, then that automatically engenders that fear and that concern, because there's not that connection. There's not that idea that we're all in relationship with each other. There's not the idea that everybody, not just people, but everything that lives here is just as important as everything else. So if you're kind of looking at it from a different perspective, then it's a lot easier to see that, okay, that might not be so threatening.
Yeah, and somebody had asked if, you know, the nature of the intertribal conflicts. And yeah, I guess I would just say, you know, like Elizabeth said, we're all living in this reality post, or what's considered post-colonialism. and we're forced kind of into this structure, the structure and way of life, it's very hard to imagine a way out. And I tell my colleagues all the time, because this is the nature of the work that we do, right? I'm full-time, the work that I do in the Global Movements Program at Why Hunger, we connect around these issues all around the globe of how social movements, peasant folks, Indigenous folks, Black urban growers, a lot of us have that collective memory of working the land for a long time, for many generations over time, and therefore have a lot of insight into sustainability. And we're realizing with the detriment of the big industrial agriculture, how we need to kind of return back to these kind of small scale food systems. But I talk about all the time that we don't know what that looks like yet with all of our people's, sharing the space and sharing this culture. But we do know that we're all relatively colonized. And so I would say that some of the natures of the intertribal conflict is because we're still trying to return home. And that's what rematriation is. Like, if you Google rematriation, talks about returning to this earth-based living, returning to this kind of spiritual earth-based living. And it doesn't mean, I have a colleague, Olivia Moore, a Penobscot Two-Spirit person, that talks a lot about rematriation as not flipping patriarchy for matriarchy. It's not like an either or. It doesn't mean all of a sudden women are the ones in charge. But we know that patriarchy is very much steeped in this kind of idea of power and dominance and control, whereas matriarchy, and it doesn't mean just women, it means all genders included, can value matriarchal principles, which is about our power from within. What are our gifts that we're born with? What is our purpose here in this network? If we think about that cosmovision and story of Sky Woman, it was Muskrat that was able to get the mud, right? Like, what are our gifts that we're contributing to the whole, or what Lisa Brooks, the Abenaki scholar I mentioned, would call the common pot. That's what matriarchy is about. It's about us living into our full potential as human beings. And at the same time, it's very hard to do that when we live in a system that's very much focused on, think about the education experience, and it's like these standardized tests, and all the teachers teach to the test, and we have to kind of be in this unified approach of showing who we are and what our talent is and what we're capable of based on kind of this one system. Whereas in traditional way, I believe, we didn't get named for a while because it was really to leave space to understand who we are as beings, and what our contribution is, what our gift or talent is. And it's not just about human beings. If we think about this as the landscape, it really flips that understanding to more of a relationality. And I'll give one example. I remember being out on the Boston Harbor Islands doing some stewardship work and removing some of the invasive species. And actually, some of those invasive species serve a purpose, right? People may disagree with me here, and I'm totally open to learning, right? But I believe knotweed is like something everybody says they can't stand, right? It's taking over everywhere. But yet knotweed has medicinal purposes that can help alleviate symptoms of Lyme disease. At least this is my belief and what I've learned from our naturopathic doctors and our medicine keepers. That things adapt and change. They're not static. They're not going to stay the same forever. And our people had an ability to really see ourselves as part of a system, and still do have that ability to see ourselves as part of a system. And what is our relationality to each thing? So right here, I'm bringing up the example of knotweed, or like some of the other invasives we removed. I know artists that have worked with bittersweet that have made beautiful artistic structures from that. We make tinctures from the knotweed that assist in alleviating symptoms from disease. there's so much more to explore in how we relate to the landscape, but yet we're still kind of stuck in this structure. And, you know, I know because I come from the field that a majority of the conservation organizations come from this kind of perspective that we just need to let things be and there has to be little human interaction. But if we're not interacting with it, if we're not learning about the gifts and the properties and the qualities that we all bring to the common pot, we're not really connecting as kinship. We're not really connecting as kin, as a relative. And so therefore we end up having this kind of perception that we have dominance and power and control over something if we want it or if we don't want it, but it's really not about us. I think if anything, COVID should be teaching us that. Yeah, I don't know. We're having just a few minutes left, Elizabeth. Are there other questions that you're seeing or things that you want to respond to from folks?
Elizabeth, you're on mute.
I think we've covered a lot of the questions.
I would say Elizabeth and Kristen, a little bit about seeing a little bit about what's some follow-up, or are you open to being contacted, or how would people find out more, or what would be some next steps? I'm seeing some of that. I don't know if you want to talk about kind of from here, if people want to learn more or do more, what would they do?
Well, I would say I think if there are people that want to get in touch with me, I would request that it go through the Essex National, what is it? The National, I can't see the
Essex Heritage is fine. Essex Heritage.
Essex Heritage, yes. So I requested it because folks have my contact there rather than emailing me directly, because honestly, I'm like pretty overwhelmed. But I'm willing to, to talking to folks if it's something that I think that I can actually assist with, or be that it fits into what I'm doing. As Kristen is saying, what are we here for? If it fits into that, then yes. I think in terms of learning the history, that's not that hard. You can do that. Anybody can do that if you really try. And then I think it's really hard to answer questions in terms of next steps, because honestly, when I talk to people, there's so much that's about relationship, and that it's very hard to say, well, somebody can do X, Y, and Z if we don't know what it is that they can bring. So when people ask, like, what can we do? It's kind of like, well, I need to have a conversation. We need to kind of have a relationship around what that might look like. And again, this might be a place where Kristen has a different perspective.
I'm probably similar to you, Elizabeth, that in a perfect world, we all would be able to keep on top of it. One thing just to remember, because we get this a lot, Elizabeth, you may remember one time we were in a meeting with with a land manager, and they're like, why aren't more of you here? And if we just really think about like how challenged we are being a small community that has survived genocide, and then the fact that we're all kind of forced to live in this way that we've got to make our money and pay our rent. Like, we've got so many folks that are struggling to do just that. And yeah, I just wish I could respond to everybody. So I am open to being contacted. I just ask that people be really patient. Every day I feel like there's someone I didn't get back to that I should have. So there's that. And it's similar to, like, if there's something that we feel is really critical, you could also follow Eastern Woodlands Rematriation, which is a collective of folks. So sometimes people will message there and have kind of broader questions, and someone will hopefully respond. But yeah, I think just learning the history, seeing what could be offered, especially to where I do so much land work. I can only speak for like that consideration. If there's people who are landowners here and want to share access to something that we may not have access to for gathering purposes or medicines, God, every time around maple tapping season, I'm like, we've got no maples to tap. And I know landowners who provide access for the tapping, and like, we'd be happy to share with some of that harvest. Or, maybe somebody has access to a fish run where they're at, so we can go fishing for our people. But that is the real change work that's going to happen, is folks that are conditioned to believe we've got to hold on to everything we have, or we're going to like be in some great loss, being more inclined to share. And it doesn't have to just be Native folks, right? Like, it could just be having that mentality of that rematriation mentality and being more generous with each other, and really raising this next, because I don't want my kids to grow up in this kind of way that we're all either hoarding or thinking it has to be the dominant way, and that we're not open to diversity and not open to other ways of being or belonging to the landscape. Like, those are ways, when we can change this kind of system and thought that we're in, that has been really rough for our people. There's a lot of hope when we can change that, when we see people being more generous or more open. So yeah.
I think this it is very hard to get away from this. If you win, I lose. If I win, you lose. You can feel it's hard for us to move past that. I think if you could share some other maybe sources, give them to Ryan and myself and Sherry, we'd be happy to share them. I know that it should be easy to find all the history, but it actually doesn't seem to be quite as easy for some of us. So there's some really good sites or places. Please feel free to share, because I know we've even been looking at some of the land acknowledgement and the different tribes, and I thought your maps were very helpful today. And they look a little bit different than some of the stuff we've seen as well. And so I think it seems like looking at the chat, there's a lot of interest in knowing more and learning more. And so even if you have some things that you think are pretty simple and obvious, I think there's some real hunger out there to see that. So we'll be happy to distribute that. But I think, this is going on for over an hour and a half. Really appreciate it. Really very, very interesting, very moving. So I don't know if you have any last words, but I don't really want to keep you much longer. I know you've been very busy, and I know Elizabeth had some health problems. So I think really I just appreciate all your time and thoughtfulness tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Good night.
Safe.
Good night.
Take care.